So here we are again. This is the Democracy at Work North County Action Group. We are resuming our reading of Richard Wolff's Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism, and we are picking up where we left off in Chapter 1. We'll be starting with Section 1.3, Capitalism, 1970s to 2007, the crisis building from below.
Really quick, just wanted to say that's North County, San Diego.
Thank you for clarifying. North County, San Diego, with our tentacles in the Inland Empire. And a real quick shout out to our maybe one day sponsors, Modern Times Beer, based there in sunny San Diego, a employee owned, or at least moving in the direction of employee owned enterprise. And I am enjoying tonight the Modern Times Beer Hoppy Tropical Wheat. And so I will let you know how the enjoyment of that progresses throughout the rest of this reading.
Sounds good.
So would you like to begin, or do you want me to begin?
Go ahead, that's fine if you begin.
Okay. So Section 1.3. The 1970s brought to an end more than a century of rising average real wages in the United States. It had been a remarkable run for workers, unmatched by workers' experiences in any other capitalist country. U.S. capitalism had been so profitable, its workers' rising productivity so steady, that capitalists could sustain capitalist growth by continuing to raise real wages in response to the U.S. economy's major problem. That problem was a labor shortage. From the beginning of the colonial era, as arriving Europeans ethnically cleansed the native population, the profit possibilities of vast, fertile lands, good harbors, welcoming European markets, and a conducive climate were endangered by the problem of finding enough labor. Part of that problem was solved for the southern states by the slave trade. But a major part of the solution was wave after wave of European immigration. Real wages, higher than workers received or could anticipate in many parts of Europe, and rising real wages were key to inducing European immigrants to journey to the United States. Not only were rising wages needed to entice immigrants, they were needed to keep them as wage earners. Employers on the eastern seaboard understood that they needed to increase wages if they were going to keep workers from moving to the ample, nearly free lands of the U.S. interior, where they might resume lives not so different from those of their European origins. For more than a century before the 1970s, labor shortages were recurring problems, thus driving real wage increases. The profitability of U.S. capitalism enabled it to pay rising real wages. Employers benefited, though, from the fact that labor productivity grew even faster than real wages. This meant that profits rose, and the result was a century of dramatic U.S. economic growth until the 1970s. But in the 1970s, a set of broad economic changes ended the historic labor shortage just as U.S. capitalism shifted to a relatively more laissez-faire phase. Real wages for U.S. workers stopped rising. Wages in real terms have never had a sustained rise since the early 1970s. The fallout of this transformation in the U.S. economy has been profound and contributed greatly to the crisis that began in 2007. Real wages stopped rising because of changes on both sides of the labor market. Demand for workers declined in two major ways, while the supply of workers rose in two major ways. The demand for labor in the United States fell because the introduction of computers across the manufacturing and service industries in the 1970s and 1980s represented a sharp turn toward automation in the U.S. economy. The demand for labor also fell because of the simultaneous movement of many manufacturing jobs out of the United States to locations where workers could be hired for far less. The export of U.S. manufacturing jobs took off in the 1970s and 1980s, followed by the export of service sector jobs, so-called outsourcing, a trend that has continued into the present. Both of these economic developments were responses of U.S. capitalism, partly to a long period of rising real wages, and partly to the post-war revival by the 1970s of real competitors to U.S. capitalism, especially in Europe and Japan. real wage increases that once had been affordable became competitive liabilities, pushing U.S. capitalists to seek profits as well as competitive advantages by substituting cheaper foreign workers for higher wage domestic ones.
It's interesting.
Yeah, did you have any thoughts on that?
How fair and just wages equal competitive liabilities.
Oh, yeah. And hey, by the way, do you know what he means when he uses the term real wages?
I noticed that he was not just saying the word wages and included the word real. I don't know specifically what he means, no.
So, from what I understand, it's somewhat of an economistic term, but it means wages in relation to what they can buy. So it's taking into account commodity prices. So that
Okay,
is,
I see.
so that is like, if there's a lot of inflation,
Exactly.
with taking outside the labor, apart from the labor market, so rising prices of goods and services, and wages say go up, but the inflation goes up and makes the commodity prices go up that much more, then you haven't really gotten much in terms of
Exactly.
a wage benefit there. And so that's what he's talking about. It's a sensible way of thinking about wages too, obviously, because the point of wages is to be able to buy things, and if the things you're buying are that much more expensive, well, that should be taken into account, obviously.
Yes, definitely.
Do you want to pick up where I left off?
Whenever you want me to take over, just let me know and I'll take over. So.
Okay, go for it.
Just as these, I think this is where you left off.
Yep.
Just as these decreases in labor demands hit the U.S. economy, two new groups of people were moving en masse into the U.S. labor market in search of jobs. First were millions of adult women who were changing their self-definition and their lives. Often this happened through participation in the women's liberation movement, which became socially powerful and influential in the 1970s. No longer satisfied with traditional roles as wives, housekeepers, and providers of childcare and other unpaid household labor, many women sought full-time paid employment. The supply of labor surged as women entered the workforce by the millions. This development coincided with a new wave of immigration into the United States, this time mostly from Latin America, especially Mexico and Central America. Once again, capitalism's uneven development drove mass worker emigration from these areas, and for many, the United States was the most attractive destination. Journalist Juan Gonzalez has called this immigration flow the harvest of empire.
Real quickly, do you know who Juan Gonzalez is?
Is he? No, I think I'm getting him mixed up with a certain philosopher, but no, they're not the same person. No, I don't know who that is.
He co-hosts Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. He's not on there as often anymore, but anyway, he also wrote a book titled The Harvest of Empire.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, have you read it?
I've read parts of it, yeah. I think I have it somewhere sitting around on the bookshelf, stuffed away. But hey, real quickly, I know you just read a paragraph, but I am kind of interested. I think the first time that I encountered this full narrative / argument is from Wolff. So other economists and political economists and theorists and everything have emphasized the decline in U.S. manufacturing jobs that have been shipped overseas. Same thing with the service sector jobs. But the labor shortage emphasis, I think others have done it, but maybe not to the extent that Wolff tries to analyze it. And so that's kind of interesting. And one of the things that he mentions here, right, is you had the influx of women into the workforce as a consequence of the women's liberation movement. But I wonder to what extent, and maybe he will go on to make this connection as we read further, but to what extent that was less just a byproduct of a seeming gain that women were struggling for, as much as it was, at least in part, a response to some of the other crises that he elaborated, meaning the lack of, decent paying manufacturing jobs, right? And so needing that extra income, say a family needs that extra income.
Ah, I see what you're saying.
And maybe it becomes possible now, right? As maybe more possible and easier for a woman to get a job than it was before as a result of the women's liberation movement and other things. But it's also more necessary in many cases, perhaps.
I'm pretty sure that women were starting to enter the workforce in a more broad way before jobs started getting outsourced. Because I think, as he was saying, the jobs are getting outsourced really picking up in the 80s.
Well, 70s and 80s. I mean, it really started in the 70s. But yeah, you're right. I think it probably proceeded that much more intensely in the 1980s.
Much, I don't think.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a fair point, though. And
yeah.
But it is worth thinking about, and I think it's something that he and Harriet Fraud have talked about.
Yeah.
That now it's much less a choice of a woman, like, what do I want to work or not? It's but I really have to, because a single parent household is oftentimes not going to cut it. With
exactly.
The majority of jobs that are available. Was there something else? Something that I had read, I think, that I wanted to just briefly mention before we move on. This is something that I've encountered elsewhere, but it's important, I think, to understand that those international competitors, that is, folks in Europe and folks in Japan, that they were not so much a factor in the immediate aftermath of World War II because of the massive destruction that their countries faced. And so the industrial sectors there had to kind of rebuild themselves, and that's what a lot of economists and historians of political economy would suggest allowed, or was one factor that allowed the U.S. to become so economically dominant, is because it didn't have that international competition, the same level of international competition, because of the results of World War II.
I had never thought about that.
But eventually, of course, they recovered and built up massive manufacturing themselves, and so that international competition around the 1970s, actually, I think is a fair estimate. And so that's one more factor that I think he at least alludes to appropriately, in my view.
Yeah.
Okay, you can continue. Sorry about that.
No. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which President Clinton signed in 1994, facilitated U.S.-based multinationals' exports into and investments in Mexico. This destroyed the livelihoods of millions of Mexicans, especially farmers and small shopkeepers, who faced unspeakable economic hardship unless they emigrated. Mexico not only managed to export millions who no longer had decent job prospects in their native country, it also benefited from the massive cash inflow of remittances sent by Mexican workers in the United States back home to relatives and friends. So I wanted to pause here for a second. I'm not sure if I follow this. Maybe you can clear this up. So with the passing of NAFTA, as Wolff puts it, it facilitated multinational exports into and investments in Mexico. This destroyed the livelihoods of millions of Mexicans. How does the one lead to the other? I don't follow that.
So
I would have thought it would have brought more jobs for Mexicans.
So there might have been some new jobs that cropped up, and some industries might have gotten a boost. But notice he says especially farmers. And so one of the main things there is that U.S. agribusiness was super subsidized. And so corn and other products, other agricultural products, being exported into Mexico now at a much more rapid rate. And you know, Mexican farmers, campesinos or whatever, they couldn't compete with that heavily subsidized U.S. agribusiness.
Oh yeah, okay, because I understand that. I mean, what you just said regarding exporting our corn to Mexico would undermine the farmers of Mexico. That makes sense. I just didn't, because he says this destroyed the livelihoods of millions of Mexicans, and I kind of, it made me think of a sort of version of industrialization where, you know, farmers ended up, you know, migrating to the cities of their respective states or countries. And I was thinking that the farmers would end up kind of going towards these new places to work, like the facilities brought up in Mexico because of NAFTA. Although I'm sure there wouldn't have been enough facilities to accompany or to actually, there wouldn't be enough
to
jobs
compensate
for the individuals who needed.
Right, and I think that's right, but yet there were probably enough to also undermine U.S. manufacturing, I would assume. Because, a lot of organized labor in the
absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of organized labor in the U.S. was very opposed to NAFTA, too. And speaking of Mexican farmers, so do you know what happened the day that NAFTA was, I guess, passed?
No.
Or that it went into effect? January 1st, 1994 was the day that the Zapatistas, that they staged their rebellion against the Mexican government. And so they did that not just coincidentally, but also because there was, a very conscious indictment of the Mexican government's complicity with that and their consistent efforts to repress and impoverish a lot of, especially indigenous Mexican farmers,
I see. All right, we'll continue then.
Okay.
NAFTA's benefits accrued to a tiny elite of Mexican employers, whereas its huge costs were more democratically distributed. These unequal consequences of NAFTA threatened major economic disaster for Mexico, which postponed it for a time thanks to the mass emigration and remittances mentioned above. After the next capitalist crisis hit in 2007, the housing industry dragged the whole U.S. economy into a deep, prolonged downturn that cost millions of Mexican and other immigrants their jobs in the United States. They began returning to Mexico, and the remittance flow to Mexico decreased. What emigration had postponed for Mexico, coping with the disastrous consequences of uneven capitalist development and NAFTA, the 2007 crisis in the United States brought crashing back to an utterly unprepared country. Mexico quickly descended into social disintegration, marked by spiraling unemployment, the explosion of the drug industry, police and government corruption, and daily accounts of violent social decline. Thus, the combination of computerization, exported jobs, women surging into the labor market, and a new wave of immigration ended the period of rising real wages in the United States.
That's a very good summary statement there.
Sum up, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And we didn't emphasize what he had said before, of course, rightfully, and maybe this should have been one of the major things we put emphasis on, but computerization, the ways in which that rendered a lot of otherwise human-intensive jobs kind of obsolete.
That's it, yeah. And then I think we're still in for another pretty big transformation when it comes to mechanization. Oh my gosh, that's going to be I think that's going to bring about an incredibly different type of, I don't know if you would say economy or a different type of just population in general, with the whole idea of what do they call it? The universal basic income. That's, oh my gosh. Because I personally, I'm not versed enough to really have many answers to this question, but I can't really think of any alternatives when mechanization really takes off and the jobs dwindle down to a very, very diminutive amount. And so, I mean, I don't really see any other alternative to universal basic income, although, there might be something, like I said, I'm not really versed in it, but if we do go with it, wow, it would just really change the makeup of this country in a profound way. I'm kind of excited for it, to be honest.
That's a very optimistic outlook, not in terms of the benefits that would be reaped from universal basic income, but in terms of thinking that it would actually come to fruition, because, well, I think that would be awesome, and would actually challenge some of the fundamentals of capitalism, too, for that matter.
Of course. Yeah.
Some of the, defining characteristics of it. I'm just not as optimistic that would actually get passed, even though there might, reasonably, logically seem like no other option. to a sane person, but I'm not so confident in the idea that sane people run the country. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, though. And I mean, so I'm glad we touched on this, right? Because that is one of the technological advance is one of the major things that consistently reshapes capitalism and forces the system to reshape itself, and one of the things that also always often potentially undermines it. And so that would be great if we went in kind of that direction. But we'll see. Like, my fear is much more pessimistic, if not apocalyptic.
I don't really have an optimistic outlook on it. I actually see it happening simply because I really don't think anything else could happen. I mean, I don't know how soon it's going to happen. I don't know what shape it's going to take, and I don't know if it's going to be super gradual or in some way or another. But when the jobs go away, what other option will there be for individuals to make a living with? What other options? I mean, I don't know. I think that this could probably have its own, podcast to,
Sure.
allotted to it. But I have no idea what other option there could be. And I don't know if it would be a good thing to do it or not. I don't know if there's something, maybe better that we can't even see from here. Maybe certain industries are going to be emphasized instead of others that'll kind of take the burden of it. But yeah, I'm not.
Well,
really
not to unnecessarily embark on that other podcast, but I mean, I do want to, maybe touch on just some of the philosophical questions real quickly, because I often hear the argument that it's such a terrible idea because people need the incentive to work and whatever,
Sure.
and there is certainly, I think, a modicum of truth to the idea that if you don't have consistent, reliable work within the functionings of a capitalist economy as we understand it and know it, then it can cause some problems for you personally, psycho-emotionally.
I would argue there's more than a modicum of evidence for that.
Sure. Now, in a society in which you're not maybe as defined by, and not you, but just socially, individuals are not primarily defined by that work, and that there's more free time that's opened up, and maybe you become more defined by, or you can define yourself more by the kind of free creative work that you do for others. I mean, I think that's a real possibility, and I think to discard that just out of hand is not it doesn't make sense. There's no evidence to say that having not been tried is never going to work, and I don't think you can make a psychological argument to say that it won't, because I think actually there's evidence to support that argument in the limited context in which it's been applied, right? In ways in which, when people aren't, as made into, when they aren't put in positions of extreme servitude in capitalism, having to work nonstop just to make enough to survive, that they do engage in a lot of interesting things that can benefit other people, and not to mention all the other unpaid, emotional labor and the reproductive care labor that goes on, and how important that is. And if there was more time that people could devote to that, right, maybe we wouldn't be so reliant on everything that's commodified.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more.
Anyway, so I just want to mention that.
And I do, just really quick to say, I do agree that if this were to occur, there would be a shift in, as you put it, social definition, as far as what we, how did you put it? Like, instead of a person being, finding their worth in work where they get a income from it, worth would kind of come from a more personal, seeking of their own maybe hobbies, or, like you said, creative practices, skills, crafts, things like this would kind of take in more importance at that point, and leisure would be upped in a certain way.
Yeah,
So,
and in the U.S., that's so needed. Comparing or contrasting us with European countries, the amount of vacation time the workers in the U.S. get, it's like nil. It's nothing.
It is actually literally zero as far as what is mandated.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true.
I just heard that from actually Wolff, or no, it wasn't from Wolff. It was from someone else. I don't remember who. But anyways.
But real quickly, I'm just gonna say all those things you say that you just mentioned. I would say yes, those are distinct possibilities that should not be discarded out of hand. Distinct possibilities as to what would occur were something like a universal basic income implemented.
Yes. Now, so I'll continue. I'm just going to read that last sentence just because it's kind of an important one. Thus, the combination of computerization, exported jobs, women surging into the labor market, and a new wave of immigration ended the period of rising real wages in the United States. Capitalists from Main Street to Wall Street quickly realized that employers could slow or stop wage increases, given that supply now exceeded demand in the labor market. Thus, real wages today are roughly what they were more than 30 years ago. That's quite a statement in and of itself.
Yeah.
It's so eye-opening. It's so eye-opening to think of that. It's so counterintuitive. I don't know if counterintuitive is the right word, but it's absurd. I don't know.
It's absurd, and it's one of those absurdities that defies the prevailing narrative, right? And that's maybe why it strikes us. It's so ridiculous because.
And the current narrative hides behind the idea of increased. What's that special word? Not success, but just like prosperity.
Yeah.
But the prosperity is occurring at the top with CEOs and certain positions, certain executive positions making so much that it's making it look as if we're continuing prosperity, but it's only occurring at a certain top sliver, as maybe a Bernie Sanders might say. But saying to someone, hey, guess what? I don't know if you're aware of this, but real wages today are roughly what they were about 30 years ago. It almost sounds like it's impossible that would be true, given the idea of inflation, general just inflation occurring over time, and I don't know. It always throws me for a loop when I read that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the best. I mean, that fact it's the best illustration that wages have not kept pace with productivity at all in the last couple decades.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm gonna have to take a moment, and if we could pause this, I don't know if we were able to do that last time. I think we were.
Not very successfully, but I can make do.
I'll be back in like 30 seconds.
Okay. So while Frank has taken a break, I'll use this opportunity to again plug our friends at Modern Times Beer there in San Diego. I'm tonight drinking their hoppy tropical wheat, and I must say that it's not overly fruity, and that's a good thing because I feared that that's what I would experience, but I don't much care for the fruitiness in my beer, and thankfully MTB, Modern Times Beer, has me covered with this one. The hoppiness, it's just that right delicate balance, and maybe there's a hint of citrusiness, but if so, it just serves to kind of smooth over the hops, I think. And you could maybe say the same for the wheat. And they actually ask the question on the back of this can, does the word wheat on a can of craft beer make you assume it's some insipid macro beer analog? A tepid...
All right, back.
Oh, okay. So I was reading them the back of the Modern Times beer can that I'm holding right now.
All right.
No, but I'm done with that. I will just finish that plug by saying that Modern Times Beer, they're in San Diego. They have 2 tasting locations, both worth checking out. Again, shifting toward employee ownership, which reflects sort of the cooperative economy that we here at Democracy at Work are very keen on. And so check those folks out.
All right, so continuing. So the end of the long history of rising real wages in the United States has never received the public discussion and debate it merits. It has been traumatic for the working class. For decades, U.S. workers and their families believed that hard work would yield a rising standard of living for the family, and that each generation in this blessed land would live better than the one before.
Yeah.
The so-called American dream was within every working person's reach. Claims about American exceptionalism focused on everything but the historic labor shortage that drove rising standards of living. Politicians and pundits insisted that America's unique capitalism delivered a permanently rising standard of living to most workers because of a benevolent climate, a culture that favored entrepreneurship, civil freedoms, and even divine intervention. Working class parents promised themselves and their children better diets, clothing, housing, cars, appliances, educations, recreation and vacations, and other rewards. Until the 1970s, rising wages had enabled workers to afford to deliver on those promises. No wonder, then, that when real wages stopped rising, no matter how hard one worked, workers were unwilling to give up on those promises.
Just real quick,
Sure.
there's a statistic that I share with some of my classes when I'm kind of discussing political economy and generational differences and that sort of thing. And it's based on this report that the U.S. Census Bureau put out in, I think, 2011, a couple of years back. And one of the things that was noted was that millennials today, or circa 2011, the last couple of years, they are more likely to have a college degree than were young adults circa 1980, so essentially their parents' generation. Yet, they're also more likely to live in poverty than their parents' generation when they were young adults.
That's nice.
What's that?
I've heard that
Yeah.
statistic as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of many that illustrates the downward mobility. And I think I've talked to you about this before, because at one point I was interested in developing this theoretical concept, but the idea of déclassé intellectuals.
Sounds familiar. It's not coming to my mind.
But, I mean, essentially it's just those who have attained some degree of education or formal learning, but yet are more downwardly mobile or unable to also attain the kind of decent, well-paying and secure jobs that were previously afforded other generations before them. And so they have the, at least, if not usually more, intellectual cultivation, right? Whether that is, a college degree and what you get with that, or whether it is even maybe the technological savvy that a lot of younger folks have. And so while they have that, they're denied what was available to previous generations. And so that's why, like, somebody like Chris Hedges, actually, who writes for Truthdig, former New York Times foreign correspondent, he argued that they're kind of the catalyst for revolt, because they have these expectations and they have these skills and they have this knowledge, but they aren't able to really put it to meaningful use. And he argued, I think rightfully in some ways, maybe somewhat of a broad generalization, but a lot of the folks who were very involved in and organizers in the Occupy Wall Street movement could be categorized as déclassé intellectuals.
Aren't they also involved in Fight for 15 as well?
With what?
The Fight for 15.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Adjunct professors are
Yeah.
known in those.
Yes, I can attest to that.
So, I believe we were here. Absent any national discussion of the changing labor markets and their social impact, U.S. workers tended to blame themselves for the end of their rising real wages. They felt individually responsible for what was actually a social problem, an economy-wide set of changes. And I think his wife, Harriet Fraud, speaks a bit about this regarding like the opioid epidemic and changing gender roles and stuff like that.
Isn't there a new economic update in which his partner Harriet Fraud is interviewed and they discuss that? Is that right?
Not the most latest one, but maybe in the last 2 or 3 weeks. This last one, it was just him.
Definitely check that. You can check that out at democracyatwork.info or
correct.
rdwolff.com.
rdwolff.com, is it? Yeah, I think it is.
Yes.
Okay. Correspondingly, they sought individual responses, quote, solutions that they hoped for, to what they believed were individual problems. If real wages per hour were no longer rising, then they would work more hours per week, take a second or even a third job, and encourage other members of the household to take on regular paid work. Millions of families pursued these strategies to cope with the changes in the economy. Women, who in the wake of the women's liberation movement had their own reasons to enter the workforce, found themselves under new pressure to seek paid employment.
Oh, he answered our question, or addressed the point we raised.
Who in the wake of the women's liberation movement had their own reasons. Okay, I see. Since the stagnant wages of male workers alone could no longer support the American dream, married families needed the addition of women's paid labor to provide needed household income. And over the next 30 years, women, especially in middle and upper income groups, moved steadily and massively into the paid labor markets. Most lower income women had already been doing paid labor. This post-1970 change in the conditions and lives of American women changed their families and households in ways that also altered U.S. capitalism. Briefly, the mass movement of adult women, mostly married and with children, into paid, mostly full-time labor, transformed households and families. Wives and mothers had long held disproportionate responsibility for maintaining the emotional integrity of the traditional nuclear family and the physical integrity of the traditional household. Even after those women undertook paid labor, they still performed a major share of the emotional and physical labor involved in shouldering those responsibilities, far more than their male partners. Women doing the, quote, double shift of workplace and household jobs simply could no longer devote the same time, energy, and attention to maintaining the emotional life of the family and the physical chores of the household as they had before, adding paid work outside the household to their responsibilities. I don't know if you want to take over at this point.
Sure. Huge strains on families and households accumulated as a result of these changes. Divorce rates rose as tensions and strains within households mounted. Women brought their job stresses home, 2 incomes had to be jointly allocated, and 2 sets of job-related expenses covered. Children received less time and attention from parents. Women's former household labor, such as shopping, cooking, cleaning, and repairing clothes, appliances, and furniture, was increasingly replaced by purchasing substitute commodities, prepared meals, cleaning services, and disposable goods. Given the poor mass transit systems in the United States, when wives and mothers took paid jobs, families often needed to buy and maintain a second automobile.
Hey, look at that. I'm going for that.
On U.S. television programs, situation comedies changed from celebrating the happy, nuclear, and patriarchal family of the 1950s and 60s to laughing with compassion at the increasingly dysfunctional families of the last several decades. A historically unprecedented and growing proportion of the population began choosing not to get married. Flowing from these family and household changes, U.S. consumption of all kinds of psychotropic drugs, legal and illegal, has soared. We became in one revealing phrase, a Prozac nation. Millions of family and household members felt acutely troubled that the support provided for them by traditional institutions seemed to be dissolving. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and the Republican Party, sometimes separately and sometimes together, found that by championing a return to family values, they could very effectively draw new adherents. The U.S. economy adjusted to all these changes in family and household life, which were themselves consequences of earlier economic changes, above all, the end of rising real wages. The prepared food and pharmaceutical industries boomed, so too did the women's clothing industry, which quickly discovered that women who took full-time paid work outside the home needed new wardrobes. The pornographic industry grew fastest of all. As the manufacturing sector kept shrinking relative to the service sector, typically male-identified jobs declined relative to female-identified jobs. Men's real wages stagnated and became insufficient to yield the American dream for their families and necessitated more women entering paid employment. The stresses and strains of all these changes made many men, raised with ideals of masculinity based on providing for their families, feel diminished, emasculated, and devalued. For many, pornography provided, in voyeuristic fantasy, the male control and domination that had eroded in their real lives. Despite more hours of paid labor by more household members, the financial conditions of millions of households did not improve much. Women's entrance into paid labor added a new set of new costs that absorbed a major part of their additional income. Paid childcare was far costlier than family members caring for children in the home. Prepared meals cost much more than raw food. A second car sharply increased household expenses, as did buying and cleaning women's workplace clothes for service sector jobs. Household maintenance became increasingly a cost covered by cash outlays rather than the product of household members' labors. The higher education of daughters finally became as important a family consideration as that of sons, and that also meant higher household expenses. Real quickly, I kind of wanted to take slight issue with this idea of prepared meals costing more than raw food, and I don't think that's necessarily accurate, because I think a large reason that folks turn to, whether it's prepared frozen meals that they can get at the grocery store, whether it's fast food, is that it's cheaper. It's faster, for one, for sure, and that's important if you're working 2 or 3 jobs, or working as much as you can, regardless, to try to just survive. But, and, you know, taking care of kids and all the rest of it, which now you don't have time to just devote yourself to. But also, it's I think, cheaper than a lot of fresh produce. And that's what draws people to it.
I'm not so sure about that.
You don't think you can get like $1 menu item in McDonald's cheaper than you can preparing a lot of fresh produce that you have to put together? It's not like you can just feed a kid a tomato. You know, you have to. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you factor in time, you would have to factor in time to get a legitimate conclusion. But I really don't know. I mean, getting something from the dollar menu is, yes, it's only $1, but it's $1 for one meal. Whereas if you make a dinner that lasts for a couple of days and you add everything up, I don't know if it would actually be more expensive. Now, I mean, because nowadays, and I'm not sure if it's always been this way, but produce isn't really all that expensive unless you've got a thing for organic food, because if you're that person, then this is totally out the window. But,
right.
Produce isn't really all that expensive. And putting it all together for a meal that lasts a couple days...
Well, I mean, it's not just that they'd be eating produce, though, right? I mean, it's not just... unless you only feed kids salads all the time. But putting all that stuff together in combination with, you know, whatever other kind of main foodstuffs that you're going to include, I mean, I think the price adds up. At least that's been my shopping experience. And it's not, and I opt for that, but I, you know, sometimes think, even though I'm shopping as economically as possible most of the time, that it would be cheaper if I, again, just got something from the dollar menu. Like, fast food is pretty cheap, man. And that's why it appeals to a lot of people.
Certainly. No, and I'm not saying that it's not cheap. I'm just saying that I'm willing to bet that if you were to look at the costs, it would be maybe a little closer than you're thinking. I definitely don't know if one is cheaper than the other.
Mm-hmm.
But it's I think that when you factor in time, you might be correct, because it is quite time consuming to prepare everything. And
sure, I mean that's maybe as big an issue for sure.
I was tricking myself into thinking that I was only including produce and not thinking about starches and the meats that would be included. The meat is not cheap, depending on how one goes with it. But
right, but I appreciate, and I'm sure many nutritionists would too, your attempt to promote the healthy eating lifestyle, regardless of whatever economic constraints people face, and that's worth doing because we have to be healthy enough in order to change things. So I appreciate that, though.
Well, no, yeah, I mean, I mean, we're just talking about economics right now as far as which one's cheaper than the other. When it comes to like decision making, as far as like what's more nutritious, I mean, there's obviously no argument to be had.
Yeah.
I don't know. I have to say that, and I mean, this might drag us into another argument, but as far as what parents can pay for, relying on fast food to feed your kids because it's faster, and let's say for the sake of argument that it is cheaper, I do not think is a legitimate thing for a family to do. I think it's an irresponsible thing for a family to do. Now, if you end up being right in the intense realm of, it's actually way cheaper to do that, then I understand the family might not have the funds to actually buy food to make and sustain them over, a couple days for each meal or whatever. I understand that, but I don't think that it's legitimate for a family to rely on fast food and cheap $1 Stouffer's meals to feed their kids. I think that's
right. I mean, that's fair enough. Although there's some relatively less awful fast food that's available to families too, that's still again pretty cheap. And again, if you're comparing it to, I mean, there's Subway or whatever, which I mean isn't terrible. You can get fruits and vegetables, or you can get vegetables anyway. But some of that, I think, compared to maybe the most low-cost stuff that you'd get at the grocery store, I'm not sure that the nutritional value is always above and beyond with the latter. But
the hamburger helper.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're right. Rice-A-Roni hamburger helpers. I've had my fair share of those meals.
But what was I? But what I was gonna say also that, I mean, yes, if there are parents listening with children, I think are on the same page that we'd prefer you not to consistently and regularly feed your children fast food at the expense of healthier options.
Yeah. Which is a completely different realm of topics that is not really...
Yeah, but I was going to add, too, that sometimes it's not, families with children, it's just couples, too, that it's like, my own individual, or our individual decisions that, well, it seems like surviving is easier by getting, again, that dollar menu item, because it's cheaper. And again, as we said, the time issue, it's like, if I got to work again in a couple hours, I really don't feel like chopping the lettuce and celery or whatever,
See, and that really brings us to two different topics, because I mean that the truth is with that, it gets really like nitpicky. I don't know what the right word for it is, but the idea of like if you showed me a couple that was so overwhelmingly bogged down by work and just trying to sustain themselves, they've each got 2 or 3 jobs, let's say, or whatever, and they start, doing the whole eating out all the time cheap meals or whatever because it's quick and easy. And
and also because they don't always have the same schedules too, right?
Exactly, and even with that, even factor that in, I don't think that you could ever, at least in this country, I don't think you could ever get to the point where you couldn't make one meal at one time in the week that would last you all week, at least when it comes to dinner. There's got to be, if you don't have time.
Yeah, at least when it comes to dinner, because not everybody can come home for lunch or during the day at all.
Yes.
And also some people work at dinner time, and so I'm not sure if I'm fully on board with that. And I know you're right about the nitpickiness, but I think some of those subtleties and some of those actual lived experiences matter a little bit.
My opinion is a bit more I don't know what it's called, but I think it would be a little bit on the side of I don't know, Christ. I don't know what the word is for it, but I place more blame on ignorant decision making and irresponsibility than I do on constricting economic hardships.
And that's interesting to note just really quickly, because I think I would be the opposite, and it's not that I would at all justify necessarily, and justify is even a strong word for me, but I guess I wouldn't justify those choices, but I would say that they are likelier choices, and they shouldn't be the go-to choices if there was a more just economic system.
I agree with that. Well, yeah, of course.
Okay.
Of course that's true.
Do you want me to keep reading?
Yeah.
Alright, was I at U.S. families? Is that where I left off?
Yeah, I think so.
U.S. families discovered that doing more hours of paid labor and covering the associated extra costs left too little net income to offset the impact of stagnant real wages. The American dream increasingly moved beyond working families' reach. Threatened with the prospect of slowing consumption, advertisers intensified their association of personal worth and success with the extent of one's consumption of commodities. Without rising real wages, and unable to earn enough with extra hours of labor, U.S. households turned en masse to the only remaining way to achieve the American dream: borrowing. Mortgage debt soared, partly enabled by rising home prices and partly contributing to those rising home prices. More borrowing to buy homes increased demand for them, and thus their prices. As prices rose, homeowners could refinance and borrow more against the increased collateral their rising home values represented. This wonderful, virtuous circle yielded a housing expansion that fueled an economic upturn. When the Federal Reserve, anxious about a recession after September 11, 2001, lowered interest rates quickly and sharply, the housing expansion became a housing bubble. When that broke in 2007, the virtuous circle turned into a vicious circle of falling housing prices, reinforcing declines in mortgage credit and rising rates of home foreclosures that further depressed housing prices. The housing industry's depression from 2008 onwards has been a major cause of the depth and duration of the economic crisis, making it the worst since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Other forms of personal debt skyrocketed as well. The credit card was transformed in the 1970s from a non-debt accumulating convenience for business and elite travelers to a debt accumulating necessity for nearly everyone. As working families more often needed 2 cars to enable multiple members to undertake paid work, auto loans became important components of household debt. Finally, higher education for multiple children, deemed a necessity for future job and income prospects, attached mounting levels of debt to students. Unprecedentedly, high and rising consumer debt in all these forms became a basic fixture of the U.S. economy in the new millennium. Widely quoted statistics showed that when the Great Depression hit in 1929, the average U.S. family had debts roughly equal to 30% of its annual income. In 2007, according to the Federal Reserve, the comparable number was well over 100%. Across the 1980s and 1990s, and up to 2007, U.S. families worked and borrowed more and more, while real wages stagnated. Workers experienced physical exhaustion from added paid labor, emotional and psychological stresses from changing labor and gender roles, and mounting anxiety about accumulating levels of debt that could not be sustained. This mix of working-class responses to the end of rising real wages postponed the national reckoning with the significance, implications, and social costs of this historic shift. However, when households could no longer manage the costs of this postponement, when they began defaulting on their debts, the system crashed. Even so, despite repeated claims to the contrary, the crash was not primarily caused by a working class that could no longer earn, borrow, or spend more, as I will explain. So pause there for a moment, because there was a lot jam-packed into what I just read. But what's, I think, kind of notable and struck me, just thinking about it, is what he said about credit card debt, and how, I guess, the both of us, being close to the same age, never really experienced credit cards like they existed in the 1970s, you know? Like, we've only known credit cards as debt-accumulating necessities for pretty much everyone.
Okay. I'm not sure if I definitely don't know what credit cards were like in the 1970s. But yeah, I'm much more familiar with them with my own life now as an adult. My parents never really used credit cards because I don't think they ever had a good enough credit to get credit cards, but I have definitely experienced them in my own faulty ways. Yeah, that I always, because this kind of brings up kind of a sort of similarity with what we were talking about before with this idea of responsibility when it comes to credit cards. There's that argument of, I mean, we should probably stay on track with the argument that he's giving, which is like, as a system, are credit cards really a good thing when you look at the impact that they've made and how easily people kind of how it can kind of get away from people and really bring families down into deep, deep debts. And
well, not just that, but that they're also a symptom of this larger crisis that has heretofore been, unspeakable for the most part.
Yeah.
But anyway, what were you going to say in addition to that?
I'm not going to, I don't really want to spend much time on this point, but it seems a lot of the times these issues and topics within economics, when it comes to microeconomics, kind of comes down to an issue of responsibility.
Yeah, and so let me stop you right there, because I've been thinking a lot about this too, actually.
Me too.
And so the question then, right, is responsibility to whom or to what, and for what reason? And so okay. What is presupposed there, right, is that there's a responsibility within this existing system to to handle your finances responsibly. But I think what Wolff is suggesting, rightfully, is that that's a near impossibility for a lot of people. Like, the expectations, and also like the expectations that are instilled in people, and the reasonable, I would say, existing in society, the reasonable ideas about the material conditions that you should face and what you should be able to obtain, that's completely ruled out if you accept this so-called responsibility, which is really just, becoming complacent with your own impoverishment. Because that's what many people face if they don't turn to these alternatives. And so, just real quickly, and then you can respond, but I remember reading in, I think it was David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and maybe in another commentary that he wrote, but he was kind of telling the same story that Wolff is, that, you know, rising real wages have stagnated and have not risen for 30-some years. But, you know, families still feel the responsibility, say, like, that father is still going to ensure that his daughter has, you know, that playhouse or whatever. And so they're going to take out loans to do that, because that's the only way possible in order for them to have the kind of standard of living, again, that's expected, that allows you to flourish in society in other ways, too, for that matter, whether it's educationally or what have you.
So, I don't know if this is splitting hairs, but I don't know if my brain is a little foggy at the moment. Unfortunately, I apologize to anyone listening, but I do see your point of individuals feeling the need to. I mean, the example you gave was kind of a sort of like keeping up with the Joneses idea. It
Sure.
seems to me like getting the daughter a playhouse is obviously not a necessity, but it's, you know, it would be a pretty unfortunate system where individuals were, you know, not able to have certain nice things like that, you know. But I think what I'm more specifically concerned with is credit card debt, as far as like individuals' spending patterns.
So real quickly then, like, I mean, as
No,
Wolff pointed out, you know, there are many cases where you need those two automobiles, as you're well aware, in order just to get to work, right? Which is part of your
Absolutely.
responsibility. And in order to get those automobiles, some people, you know, will rack up some. What's that?
Most people will.
Most people
rack
will,
up
yeah.
a debt.
And so that seems perfectly understandable and reasonable,
okay,
and it
so-
would be hard to
so what
fault
I-
somebody individually for doing that, for actually
Exactly.
trying to do what is expected of you in society.
I'm not, and that's not my argument. So
Okay.
you're arguing not against me. I'm not.
But
talking
but
about,
that is an example of racking up credit card debt, though. It could be.
No, well, I don't think it's really credit card debt. People take out loans from the institutions that they're part of to get those, to get vehicles, and a vehicle is something of utmost necessity.
They might pay that with a credit card, though. I mean, it wouldn't be all that different if they did it just straight through their financial institution.
True. But what I think I'm talking about is individuals who are using credit cards for crap. Because they have,
Okay.
Because they have a credit card and they can buy crap now.
Uh-huh.
And I know that exists, and I know for a fact that individuals do it on a grand scale. I, for one, have done it quite a bit. I'm actually doing it a tiny bit here and there these days, but not nearly as bad as I was doing it a couple years ago. But I don't have, you know, that long of a history of doing it, so. But I do know that a lot of individuals these days are doing that with credit card debt, and that is a big driving force behind, you know, why we have so much credit card debt itself. Not these, like, I would never fault someone for getting a second car, you know, using a credit card or using a loan or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the irresponsible spending of individuals who are using credit cards, who happen to have a good credit score at the beginning to actually get the credit card to begin with, but then just go buck wild and fill their home with the latest ad in whatever Nordstrom's, so that they can find happiness in that, or whatever it might be. Whatever it is,
So yeah.
it is
Yeah.
some version of irresponsibility.
Okay. Well, just real quickly, I'll
But
address
if they're
that as
using
best
their
I can.
credit card to pay for food for their kids,
Uh-huh.
that's obviously not. But I
Uh-huh.
don't know. That sounds odd. I don't know if individuals really tend to open up credit cards because they don't have enough money to feed their family.
I mean, I think people open up credit cards for a lot of basic personal expenditures when the income doesn't cover rent or whatever. And so, or if the income covers rent but not much else. I think people do pay a lot of that stuff with credit cards. I mean, I have with other credit, it wasn't necessarily a credit card, right? I mean, I did that, and I'm still paying off a loan to my credit union just because I couldn't afford basic expenses. And while, you know, maybe I had one or two very minor indulgences, I wasn't filling my house with the Nordstrom or whatever. But anyway, that the point that I wanted to address is that two things. One, Wolff has pointed this out, right? Is that financial institutions, credit card companies, those folks, they're making out like bandits in a lot of ways, and as are the larger kind of corporate structure of which they're a part, because again, workers, while they're more productive than they have been, so productivity has been rising, they haven't been compensated in accord with that productivity. That means there's more surplus that's being extracted from what it is they produce that they don't get to control. More of that is going to the corporations and their shareholders, etc. And that being the case, right, and I think this is central to Wolff's argument, is that there's less money that they probably should be having, that in a more justice system that they would have, meaning they would have that money to buy the Nordstrom or whatever. They would have that higher standard of living, but they don't, precisely because of the changes in the capitalist economy that have benefited more those at the top in partly just to sustain the system, and also, just in addition to that, workers are kind of getting screwed twice. Not only are they not getting compensated for that extra productivity, but also, because they aren't, in order to acquire many of the things that are, you know, needed now just to like live a decent, manageable life, because again, more things are commodified, then they're taking out loans to do it, and they have to pay those loans back with interest. And that means that, so not only are they not getting as much as they should from their employer directly, if we, you know, compare that to previous generations and to what we might think would be the best minimal rate of exploitation, but then also, because of that, they are paying more to large corporations in interest rates. So they're screwed twice.
I agree with all that.
Okay, but my point was just that, I guess my main point in response to you, and we can agree to disagree, was that I think the individual responsibility isn't as big an issue, because the main issue is that people should, by and large, have that money to begin with, and they would if that rate of exploitation hadn't increased.
I agree with that as well.
Oh. Okay,
sometimes I feel that individuals give people a pass for their irresponsible behavior because of these larger economic issues regarding the system and the banking shenanigans that are occurring, and loans, and the fact that the system, as you said, makes it so that people need to use a financial institution to buy the things that they should in a just system have, but now they're doing so where now they're able to do it, but they have to pay interest on it, which is ridiculous, and I agree with all that, but there is still absolute irresponsibility occurring on the part of the consumer when it comes to them having credit cards, when they, you know, if they don't make enough money, and if they don't make enough money to get the Nordstrom catalog in their house, that I don't think that just because in a just system they would have that justifies them putting themselves in huge amounts of debts to do so.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the deeper philosophical disagreement as to what we mean by responsibility, and again, to what and to who, and to what extent. But anyway,
yeah. All right.
Back to the reading. Where did we leave off?
Ugh.
Oh, did we finish? We finished the section. We have the last section to finish.
That's right.
Do you want to pick up then? Section 1.4?
Sure. I think this one's only a handful of pages before the chapter is concluded.
Yeah, we're close.
Oh, wait. There's another section.
There's an untitled section that's only like a page.
Oh,
okay. No, you're right. There is another section that starts on... So you only have to read like 2.5 pages.
Yeah, in my phone it's like 8 or 9.
Oh.
That's why it was kind of throwing me for a loop. Okay, so I'll read 1.4 if you want to then read 1.5 or something like that.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, so section 1.4, Capitalism, 1970s to 2007, the crisis building from above. And I think it's helpful to note that this whole chapter is a sort of history lesson for the reader, as opposed to a fleshing out of one's theory or something like that. So
yeah, so he's given us the historical backdrop to the situation we find ourselves in, and then I think he's going to develop what he kind of promised in the introduction, that alternative. Yeah, his vision of the alternative.
Exactly, and for those listeners who aren't as familiar with Wolff as others, he tends to do that a lot in his lectures and economic updates. He tends to always include a bit about the historical backdrop of why something is occurring, which I think is really, really cool.
I mean, it's I would say it's even maybe essential to understanding the problem, and then the potential solutions that are applicable. Yep.
All right, so while household debts and the housing bubble had indeed become unsustainable, the crash resulted largely from the huge financial speculation that employers, top executives, and professionals had built up on the foundation of consumer debt. The mechanism here was straightforward. First, banks packaged consumer debts, mortgages, credit card debt, auto loans, and student loans, into a new kind of financial investment, asset-backed securities, or ABS. Where regular stocks and bonds were investments in and thus claims on companies that produced goods or services, ABS were different. ABS gave those who thought them a claim on the principal. ABS gave those who bought them a claim on the principal or interest payments of consumer loans. Those who invested in ABS received in return a portion of the regular flow of consumers' payments servicing their debts. Successful businesses were among the main investors in ABS and derivative financial instruments associated with them. To understand where ABS investors found the money to invest in and thereby fueled the explosion of ABS leading up to the crash of 2007, I will briefly explore yet another consequence of the stagnation of real wages since the 1970s. While real wages stayed flat, worker productivity rose steadily over the same period. Workers in the United States were better educated, worked with more and better machines, thanks largely to computerization, and worked harder and faster over those years. They steadily produced more output in goods and services per hour, year after year. Meanwhile, their employers did not pay them higher real wages in exchange for their higher productivity or output. As a result, the gap grew between what employers paid workers per hour and what workers produced for their employers per hour. That gap showed up as expanding employer profits. Since real wages stayed flat as productivity kept rising, profits kept climbing. This profit scenario in turn prompted a record-setting peacetime boom of the stock market. The top executives of U.S. corporations, the smaller businesses and professionals who served them, and the owners of stocks in those enterprises became very wealthy. A culture developed in which the rich competed in terms of lavish lifestyles, but also in terms of finding profitable investments where they're accumulating financial wealth. Hedge funds proliferated as businesses focused on helping the newly rich find profitable investments to become yet richer. One major new profitable investment they promoted was ABS and their associated derivatives. So now, by following the money, we can grasp the economic interconnections that drove world capitalism into crisis. First, stagnant real wages and rising productivity sharply altered the distribution of income and wealth in favor of profits and increases in wealth for the rich. Second, the working class responded by borrowing vast sums to postpone the end of rising consumption that would have been necessary that would have had been necessary if they relied only on their wages. Third, employers and the rich lent back to the workers via ABS a portion of the extra profits they made from real wage stagnation. For 30 years, these interconnections generated enough gains in the forms of rising debt-based consumption for the masses and rising wealth for the employers and the rich to reproduce the system. But the pattern was unsustainable. A pyramid of speculations was erected on ABS as ever more profit-based incomes piled into them, and on their allied financial instruments such as the peculiar ABS insurance policies called credit default swaps. By the way, I wanted to mention really quick, I should have mentioned earlier, these ABSs and now this credit default swaps, one movie that kind of illuminated these terms for me to some degree, although it's still a little hazy because I just can't seem to get the jargon down, is The Big Short. I'm not sure if you saw it, but
no.
Just for those listening, that's definitely a movie that certainly takes some time to flesh those concepts out in pretty graspable ways. Continuing. Hedge funds and banks took ever greater risks as they competed for high returns to lure investments from those who kept accumulating profits. Alongside rising investor risks, workers' rising debt levels combined with stagnant real wages to erode their capacity to service their debts. When this capacity was exhausted, growing numbers of workers defaulted on their debt obligations. So did the major banks, and many of those who had issued and owned ABS, CDS, and other speculative instruments tied directly or indirectly to the values of workers' debts. Very quickly, the capital markets, increasingly interconnected across the world by the previous decades of globalization, spread the impact of the U.S. credit collapse internationally. Financial markets had marketed toxic ABS, CDS, and related investments around the globe, and in the process facilitated the globalization of the crisis when it hit. So that ends part 1.4.
Did you have any thoughts on that?
The only thing that cropped up to my mind is the 3 or 4 times I've watched that movie, the Big Short, right? That's the name of it, I think. And I still cannot wrap my mind around some of the deeper shenanigans that were played on the part of the banks and
sure.
And how I don't know. And what was interesting to me is there was the part where you see the guy, and they kind of he's a sort of rough looking character with tattoos, and he's got this family who I guess he's renting this house, this nice looking house. So he's renting from an individual who has defaulted on his, or has not been paying his mortgage. And so you can kind of see how there's a secondary impact on individuals who, it's not only the individuals who aren't actually paying the debts that they owe because they're not getting paid enough, but it's also those who are, in the case of the housing, there's those who are renting from those who aren't getting it, and they're getting screwed as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I that was kind of interesting to me. But like I said, the ABS, the CDS, it's really tough for me to understand, to be totally frank.
I think Wolff does a pretty good job here of trying to condense all the complexities down into something that's comprehensible, and also ties it not just to the financial instruments and financial shenanigans that can get overwhelming, but also to the broader economy and its relation to people who work for wages and that sort of thing. And I think he does that pretty, and who also then accumulate debts and that. And so I think he does that really well, and so it gives us some sense of what was going on there and like how it affects folks on down through the system. One thing though that you mentioned in terms of those indirect impacts that I thought of as you were explaining the movie, which I haven't seen, but
Oh, you have not?
No, no. I just shook my head. No, I haven't seen it. But I'll check it out now. Now I'm kind of interested. But something kind of similar, I think, from my understanding of the situation, occurred with Republic Windows and Doors in Chicago, which is now, under a different name, a worker-owned and democratically controlled enterprise. One that's surviving, although I don't know if they're necessarily thriving, but they exist. And some of this was documented in a book by a friend of mine, a journalist from Southern California who's based in Chicago, Carrie Liderson. The book's called Revolt on Goose Island. And it's about how folks at Republic Windows and Doors, well, the owner of that enterprise was, not paying his debts or something to that effect. And so he was going to, and so he was threatened with, like, foreclosure of his place and bankruptcy. And so he was going to shut the place down and wasn't going to be paying the workers the overtime and or the benefits and whatever that they had accrued. And so he was just going to deny them that, and also, of course, take away their employment. And there was a sit-down strike. There was a very militant union, the UE, that the workers there had recently become affiliated with. And through the UE and just very grassroots organizing, they sat down in the factory in Chicago there, and it became a very, national outcry because it was right in the wake of all this. And people were pointing the finger at Bank of America because Bank of America wasn't, extending the loan or whatever. And while that was maybe an issue, it was just as big an issue that the employer was maybe, in your framework, not acting responsibly. Yeah. and was derelict of his owner duties and was mainly at fault there. Again, in response to everything else, and I'm sure he was dealing with the financial issues in the wake of 2007, 2008. But because there was so much ire at the banks, this got huge publicity. I think even Obama had said something about it, and it got a lot of news coverage, especially in the Chicagoland area. And eventually there was enough pressure placed on them that I think the workers were able to get what was owed to them. And then through some help with organizations like the Working World, which supports worker-owned enterprises, they eventually were able to buy the place, take it over, and convert it into a democratically owned and operated enterprise known now as New Era Windows. So there's that story. And yeah, Carrie Liderson's book is, if you get the newer edition, she has an epilogue of sorts with the new info about the cooperative. The older editions just have the story of the sit-down strike. But anyway, worth reading. So I will, I guess, take us home with section 1.5 and then the untitled section that's on the last page or so. Section 1.5, a digression on what or whom to blame. It's kind of similar to what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Capitalism drives workers and capitalists to play the roles assigned to them by the system. No matter how rigged the system, individual players seek to reap the system's rewards and avoid its penalties, to take the necessary risks and pay the necessary costs to enjoy its benefits. Capitalism also assigns the state its role in supporting and undergirding certain activities, regulating other activities, and preventing certain excesses. State officials perform these functions just as workers and employers perform their functions. Did some state officials perform badly or become corrupt prior to the 2007 crash? No doubt, but that has been true both in capitalism's upswings and downswings. Because of the durability and social influences of anti-statism on the right and left, many have been tempted to attack some or all state institutions or officials, or state-private partnership institutions and officials. Rightists see in the state's activities the roots of most evils, including cycles and crises. The Nobel laureate and economist Milton Friedman, for example, blamed the Great Depression on political intervention in free markets by the government. Republicans often claim that Democrats in Congress or the White House spend and borrow excessively, causing deficits and economic downturns. By contrast, leftists usually target one part or another of the state, and especially state-private institutions. For example, one favorite target of the left, and of the right as well, has been the Federal Reserve System, which many accuse of mismanaging the monetary system in favor of bankers, contributing to economic crises and unjust governmental bailouts. Democrats, likewise, blame Republicans in Congress or the White House for failing to grasp Keynesian insights, failing to undertake counter-cyclical deficit spending, and thereby worsening and prolonging economic crises and their massive social costs. The Nobel laureate and economist Paul Krugman analyzes the U.S. and European governments' responses to the post-2007 capitalist crisis in just such terms. These arguments, on the left and right, are peculiar. We are asked to believe that different parts of the state apparatus and different subgroups of state officials work to undermine the capitalist system. Were they not created within and continuously shaped by the capitalist system in ways that celebrated and justified reproducing that system? Somehow, in these arguments, the behavior of state institutions and officials disrupted the smooth, non-cyclical reproduction of capitalism. Otherwise, our behavior would have accomplished just that reproduction. In this view, private businesses and individuals respond appropriately and successfully to the signals, risks, and rewards of capitalism, whereas the state does not. Yet state interventions in capitalist economies were crucial to their beginnings and early growth, have been continuous ever since, and over the long historical span have mostly grown absolutely and relatively. At the same time, this focus on the state as the rogue, disruptive part of the entire system has long attracted those who, for various reasons, cannot bear to question, criticize, or even debate changing the capitalist system as a whole. Criminals are another rogue actor blamed for capitalism's cycles. The mass media and appropriate authorities routinely denounce those illegally gaming the system. The underpaid secretary who embezzles, the inside trader who makes illegal profits, the syndicates that run whole industries or cities. Such illegal economic activities happen all the time, even more so during crises. Criminal activities are thus more effects than causes of capitalism's cycles. Yet, historical and contemporary records overflow with blame variously heaped on the illegal acts of financiers, corporate executives, corrupt state officials, union leaders, and organized crime for causing capitalism's cycles and crises. Whether consciously or not, such a focus on misbehavior by the state or by criminals serves to avoid blaming the system and its rules and regulations, its structures of rewards and penalties. Pinpointing the bad guys perpetuates the ancient art of scapegoating, deflecting blame on convenient targets when in fact the system is the problem. Wrapping up here, everyone, individual or business, ever blamed for contributing to capitalism's recurring crises has defended their actions by explaining that they were just participating in the economic system, responding to its signals, and trying to succeed. For centuries, in every capitalist country, individual economic actors have been charged, convicted, and imprisoned for violating some law, and businesses have been shut down or sanctioned for similar reasons. But the individuals and businesses that follow sooner or later replicate their behavior. For example, from long before Charles Dickens' 1857 novel Little Dorrit, all the way up through the stunning multi-billion-dollar scam of Bernard Madoff, Ponzi schemes have recurred across capitalism's history. Capitalism produced these schemes, which only grew larger as the system expanded. The slave and feudal systems that preceded capitalism fostered forms of crime rooted in their mixes of economic risks and rewards. But those systems never displayed the recurring boom and bust cycles common to all forms of capitalism. These cycles are the product of capitalism, not of this or that group, the state, criminals, others, functioning within that system and in response to its upswings and downswings. Capitalist societies can continue to monitor, identify, regulate, and prosecute economic misdeeds, but doing so never will prevent cycles and crises. It never has. Overcoming the systemic roots and nature of capitalist crises requires a change in the economic system. And thus concludes
Tall order.
Chapter 1. It is a tall order indeed. Any thoughts on that last bit?
Oh, I liked it. It was nice and succinct, to the point. I'm glad that he took the time to steer us away from the ignorance of scapegoating. I'm not familiar with Little Dorrit, Charles Dickens' 1857 novel.
Neither am I, and my mom taught 8th grade lit, and I'm pretty familiar with some other Dickens stuff, but not that.
Yeah, but I'm pretty excited to hear his argument.
So am I.
Because everything he's stated so far is, I mean, pretty much everything I believe is fairly straightforward and factual and not exactly up to interpretation. It's kind of just laying out what has been going on in at least this country, but also globally. He's kind of been speaking about what's kind of brought on these booms and busts, and specifically what's going on right now, and so it's going to be pretty exciting to go over his argument.
And I'm glad that you mentioned what he mentioned, the scapegoating, and how that doesn't get at what's really the issue. And so, that happens in, I guess, myriad ways, but there's scapegoating of, say, immigrant workers who are taking jobs and that sort of thing, right? Which I don't think he was mainly focused on in that last bit, but that certainly is one consequence and response, and inappropriate and ineffective in reality, and not a very critical analytical response to some of the changes in the capitalist system that, are the result of the way that capitalism functions and what it allows. But there's also the scapegoating that I think he was mainly addressing, kind of following that line of thought of saying, there's the corrupt business leaders, there's the corrupt bankers, and he's saying it's not just that, right? And it's not even primarily that they're, not obeying obediently enough capitalism's laws, but they're acting within the capitalist system that permits this sort of thing, and then in some cases even demands these kind of responses, or at least certainly promotes them.
And the scapegoating succeeds because most individuals tend to not be really willing to go into a debate about an economic system. Very rarely do you hear a layman talking about these types of things in depth. It's much easier to be the person who is saying something like, damn that Bernie Madoff and his pyramid scheme, what a terrible person, because it's taking the blame and putting it within a context that everyone is aware, which everyone is familiar with, which is a person.
Mm-hmm.
Personhood. We're putting the blame inside of a person as opposed to inside of something that's way more complicated, namely the system that he's been.
So it's far easier to understand, and also probably it reflects some of the dominant narrative and story that we tell about ourselves and the society that we live in, right? Which primarily focuses on a theme that we've covered in this reading and discussion: individual responsibility, right? And so it's very much in accord with that sort of thing, with that way of understanding the world and economics. Couple things about that got me thinking, though. It does, so what Wolff does here, and his analysis, his systemic analysis, oh hey, I can see you again. His systemic analysis really addresses a probably unfair criticism that's leveled against, say, the left or those critical of capitalism, that, they're always blaming other people, right, for their failures. And he's saying, no, we're not blaming other people. We're pointing to what the system does, its function, and the consequences of its particular requirements or arrangements. And so I think that's really helpful. At the same time, though, I think it's important to keep in mind, which I believe he mentioned in a recent economic update, and I'm sure has done so previously, that while the system increasingly does not work for many, even some might say, with some argument, the majority of people, say in the United States, it does work pretty well for some. And so, but that's the nature of capitalism, right? So the some that we might be pointing our fingers at, I mean, there's some justification for it, saying that, you're rigging the system benefits you unjustly in ways that, really do a disservice to society and to the kind of, functioning moral and, cultural and political institutions that we'd like to have, as well as to the many people's well-being. But at the same time, understanding that it's not just them, they're just oftentimes the beneficiaries of a system that has endemic problems.
Yeah, and that's an argument that's tough for people to really go through in their mind and take the time to think about, because, like I said before, it's just so much easier to point the finger at a person as opposed to a system, But it troubles me, and this is kind of a perennial problem for me, and this is going a little deeper than the specific issues that we're talking about, but the idea of the capitalist using the capitalist system to his or her benefit, and not blaming them, because it's almost as if the individuals can they really help themselves if their dad, let's say your dad gives you $1 million, little small loan of $1 million, as happened to our current president, gives you a small loan of $1 million, and you find yourself in certain circles with certain people and doing certain things and buying certain things, and you kind of create this persona of yourself. And this can go for anyone, obviously, not just for Trump, but it's almost like it's almost like it's in our nature to be duped in these ways, And not for everyone, and not in all cases, but it's. I think one can make the argument of that it's tough for people to really do the right thing when the wrong thing is in every single vision, every single part of their vision, when the money is there to be used. And
mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right.
Very well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But what's so interesting to me is that you're making this argument here in favor of, we might say, the capitalist class, but yet you make quite an opposite argument, or at least
the argument is not in favor of them. The argument is in favor.
But justifying or at least absolving the problematic behaviors. But you didn't absolve the problematic behaviors of the individuals who should take responsibility for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, I know. No, but keep this in mind, and you're totally right, 100% right. when I was making those arguments, in the back of my mind the entire time, I'm thinking, but technically, the individuals are how beholden is an individual to his or her whims,
mm-hmm.
and to his or her nature, and so this is the perennial problem, which I haven't even really explicitly said yet, which is the problem of the will. And this is not the right forum. You know what I mean?
I know. I love the fact that we raised such a question in our reading discussion. The North County San Diego Democracy at Work Action Group is nothing if not properly philosophical and engaging in the humanistic, those perennial humanistic questions that plague.
And it's perennial for me because it's so easy on the right. The right is known for coming down on the welfare queen, or coming down on the individual for what did that fucking guy from? Oh, I don't know if I should curse. We're still doing this, right?
We're still live. We're still recording.
Jason Chaffetz. I don't know his first name. I think it's Jason, but Chaffetz, who is a member of Congress, either House of Representatives or a senator. I think he's House of Reps. Who was famous for saying something like, "Well, yeah, your Medicare is going to increase, but you'll be able to pay for it if you just don't buy that damn cell phone or don't buy that new iPhone or whatever it was."
I mean, it's like the comment that, critical of millennials saying the reason they can't afford homes is because they buy all that avocado toast. Yes. Yeah, that's what's preventing me. That's what's preventing me from paying rent. Is my avocado toast addiction. Just so everybody knows, it's been a struggle to overcome it. It's a new epidemic among the younger folks.
I still don't even really know what that is. I've never seen it. I've never tasted
Neither have I. I
don't know anything about avocado toast. But anyways, I don't think this is the right forum to get into those conversations, but it always comes up in my own internal argumentation with myself as far as, well, yeah, there's these people doing these bad things, but what are the reasons behind them doing the bad things? How culpable are they?
Sure.
What level of culpability does the mother have of buying the 2 tacos for $1 for their kids when they have a mountain of responsibilities that they have to attend to? How can one really get mad at her for doing that? But then again, what if she does it every single day for 2 years? Is she culpable then? Where's the line? You see what I'm saying? I have a woman who used to live here with us. Her name is Claudia. No one here listening will ever know who she is, I'm sure, but she has 5 or 6 kids, and she ended up having a kid with our other roommate who lived here, and now they're broken up, but they have the kid, and every single kid that she has is with a different man who she was with for a given period of time and then leaves, and then this is what she has done, and she's got like 5 or 6 kids in this way, and she is on welfare, and she has bragged about being on welfare in front of me and my wife, and talked about things of the nature of like, so why should I find a job if I know I'm going to get these checks? She said before in front of us to our other roommates who she's actually friends with. She's gone now, but with those types of individuals, I would argue, and this is where I get in trouble with myself, not to mention other people. I would argue
that's the greatest line ever. Yeah.
I would argue that even she is not culpable because of her internal workings and her family background and the influence on her life and all these things. It comes down to it comes down to puppetry, unfortunately.
So that's unfortunate because I think while I agree with a good chunk of that, I don't know if you are placing enough faith in the ability of human beings to act intelligently in the world, right? Or take responsibility or whatever. But at the same time, though, we take responsibility and act intelligently within certain contexts and with, various frames of reference and backgrounds that no doubt influence us and are primary factors for sure. One thing, though, that made me think about is, like, I am so there was, back probably in the 19th century, late 19th century, there was a debate among kind of anarchist socialist circles about partly the role of women and partly the role of family. And this is by no means like the extent of the debate, and there were probably, multiple, infinite number of debates probably would be a better way to categorize it. But one of the debates focused on whether, women should be respected as their role, assuming their role as caretakers and providers for children, in that traditional role, and whether that should be considered as liberatory, being able to do that freely, and not having to, rely on private enterprise for a wage or whatever, or even maybe a man in the most, utopic visions, or whether that it's more liberatory again, and, the same kind of debate was kind of rehashed in the 1960s, or whether it was more liberatory for them to have the same equal rights as a man engaged in that private economic system, albeit, of course, organizing and that sort of thing. And which was the proper role, or which was the preferred role, or which was the more just role. And, I mean, I haven't, ever really necessarily taken a side, but I have seen, or I have thought about and thought through some of the legitimacy of the one role that I described, that, that there is inherent value and unrecognized value in being a provider for a child, being somebody who is engaged in that kind of reproductive labor. And that if that was more valued socially, that then maybe there'd, be more interest in that sort of work, and there'd be more respect for it, and that sort of thing. And more support for it. And more support for it. And so the idea that somebody should have to work with 5 kids, like, I'm not necessarily on board with that. I mean, I understand, again, the responsibilities that you maybe assume within the existing system, but, again, holding that up to not even an ideal, but just a possibility that other arrangements would allow for somebody to engage in just as meaningful work raising those children without having to take on another job, because that's, multiple jobs in itself, I would argue. And so that's my point, is that, like, I don't find that so reprehensible as maybe some people do, because I think maybe we should socially be providing, and, maybe the decisions about how many children you have or whatever is, like, maybe problematic within the existing context, but at the same time, like, who am I to judge, and are we going to place restrictions on that? I think it's much more important that there is social and communal, I would say, support for somebody raising kids, and that person shouldn't have those same responsibilities either.
I definitely agree with you to a certain extent on what you've just said. That definitely doesn't apply to the example that I gave, because the woman in question has abandoned each one of these kids, and has gone just to another guy, and currently she's with some dude apparently that she met at a club, and the guy who used to live here, his name was Julio, he comes by and visits here and there. He has the child now, and she, sees the kid every once in a while, but, plays very little role in her upbringing, unfortunately, and, so, but no, I definitely agree. It is definitely an interesting idea, because, I that's not something I'm going to get into, but,
okay.
No, I agree with you, certainly.
So,
but,
any other thoughts on that? What's that?
We kind of went off topic there for some time.
We tend to do that, but we have concluded chapter 1. Any final thoughts on the chapter, or what to expect going forward, or we stop this recording?
No, I mean, just suggestions for those listening, if they haven't been able to listen to any of economic updates, or the monthly ones that Wolff does as well. I really like those. Those are good. He tends to get a little bit more off the cuff with those, I think. I would just highly recommend those who are listening, if they haven't already, to check those out. And I think that the upcoming chapters are going to be much more involved and bring about our participation more as far as discussing these issues, because, as we've said before, this chapter has been sort of a fleshing out of past in history and what's kind of brought this on. So that's really all I've got to say.
And what I would just say to wrap up is that this recording should be available online, as are the other recordings from our reading and discussion of Chapter 1, and maybe we will post the links to the YouTube URLs on our Facebook page. Maybe that would be a good thing to do at some point. And
Sure.
so you can check it out there and check out future reading discussions on our YouTube channel and on our North County Democracy at Work Action Group Facebook page as well.
Sounds good.
Next time we will cover Chapter 2, Crisis and Government Response, again from Richard Wolff's Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. But that concludes our reading discussion for this evening.